Our next speaker is going to be Maria Korsnick, and we are delighted to have Maria with us. She is the president and CEO of the Nuclear Energy Institute. She is right in the heart of change and the political process and the vision for the future. With that, I'd like to ask Dominic to please roll out Maria Korsnick's section, and let's get going on that.
Thank you very much, Sheila, and what a great talk that we just heard from Arshad at EPRI. Very optimistic. So thank you very much for inviting me back to this forum and having an invitation to speak today. Last year, we talked about the central challenge facing the energy sector, dramatically reducing carbon emissions while meeting the world's growing demand for electricity. Today, that challenge remains, but the landscape has shifted, and heads of state, CEOs, and investors are all charting their paths to a net zero carbon emissions. I've been fortunate to attend climate and energy conferences across the world. You know, at each stop, I've seen these plans for a clean energy system gradually take shape. Now, they vary, but they have a common element, and that's recognition that we need to bring carbon emissions from the electricity sector close to zero by 2050, and you just heard that in Arshad's talk. The Biden administration is aiming to reach net zero by 2035, and just last month, the president issued an executive order committing the federal government to get there even sooner, by 2030. In other words, the urgency to act is finally catching up to the urgency of the climate crisis. We have no shortage of high-level plans. Executing them depends on our choices. The stakes could not be higher. We need to prepare for a future that demands smarter, more reliable, and more efficient energy solutions. And I'm here to tell you that carbon-free nuclear energy fits the bill perfectly. It's the most reliable, scalable, carbon-free source at our disposal. And nuclear is no longer just one of many options. It's the key to making these plans work. We're moving towards alignment and support of nuclear's role in terms of policy, in terms of industry commitments, and in terms of interest from investors and consumers. Nuclear energy can offer carbon-free energy to both the world's largest cities and remote rural communities. It can pave the way to net zero emissions while creating good paying, lasting jobs that will propel local economies into the future. And the next generation of versatile reactors compare perfectly with other carbon-free sources like wind, solar, and hydro. So with the right decisions around nuclear energy, we can make reaching net zero a net positive. As some of you might know, nuclear accounts for 20% of the total US electricity generation and more than 50% of our carbon-free electricity. The US nuclear fleet, the world's largest, is now our second largest electricity source overall. In 2020, nuclear surpassed coal for the first time ever in terms of overall production. That year, our 94 reactors produced nearly 800 million megawatt hours of power. You know, back in 1989, it would have taken 33 additional reactors to generate that same amount of power. To have any chance at meeting our climate goals, we need to keep our existing nuclear fleet online. And we know that when nuclear plants shut down, we depend on fossil fuels. And when coal and natural gas inevitably fill the void, emissions rise. That isn't decarbonizing. It's moving backwards when we can least afford to. Just look across the Atlantic right now. Germany is shuttering 3 of its nuclear plants and planning to completely phase out the source by the end of 2022. Energy prices are soaring. Their deadline to reach net zero emissions is fast approaching. And yet we're seeing Europe's largest economy revert to fossil fuels. The entire world desperately needs to decarbonize, and the US industry needs to take the lead, and that starts with preserving our existing nuclear capacity. These are high stakes decisions. Recently, the Illinois General Assembly passed sweeping clean energy legislation preserving its nuclear plants. But had those plants shut down, Illinois would have lost more than twice the amount of clean electricity that wind and solar produce in that state combined. Instead, keeping those plants running has allowed Exelon to fill 650 vacant jobs, and the legislation jump-started more than $300 million in capital projects at the nuclear stations over the next 5 years. That's the kind of decision-making that we need to build a carbon-free future. Over the last several years, experts across government, academic institutions, and the private sector have studied the most affordable paths to a carbon-free future. And there's really no more debate. They all include nuclear. Study after study has confirmed nuclear's potential to lower system costs. Here's just one example. When Washington State pledged to produce 100% of its power from clean sources by 2045, Energy Northwest commissioned a study to evaluate its options for the next 20 years. In a complete decarbonization scenario, they found that the Pacific Northwest region could save more than $8 billion every year by including nuclear, existing and new generation, in its clean energy mix. So in other words, nuclear brings the critical component that actually makes complete decarbonization affordable. And that's true in other regions around the world. Last October, the UN Special Envoy on Climate Action and Finance told an audience in London that he had never seen a credible energy transition strategy that does not include nuclear. Moving forward, we know that advanced reactors will become more affordable than their predecessors. Factory construction will improve manufacturing quality and quantity at lower cost, getting reactors to market faster. And some new technologies use other substances like molten salt or liquid metals rather than water to transfer the heat. And this allows them to run safely at higher temperatures and lower pressures, which can also lower the design and construction cost. And quite frankly, the more we build, the more efficient and affordable that we'll get. Strong policy support this year and over the coming decade will be absolutely crucial to bringing the next generation of nuclear reactors online. And thankfully, policymakers agree. As Energy Secretary Granholm has said, nuclear is an absolutely critical part of our decarbonization equation. The Biden administration has called the next few years a can't-miss opportunity for nuclear energy. At the end of Pennsylvania Avenue, a bipartisan majority in Congress also recognizes that the path to an affordable carbon-free energy future runs through nuclear energy. And last year, Congress significantly increased appropriations to accelerate research, development, and demonstration of new technologies. Lawmakers from both sides of the aisle signed on to legislation that recognizes nuclear's contribution to today's economy and our clean energy future. As you heard from Arshad, the historic bipartisan infrastructure package that passed in October brought major investment to the industry. The $1.2 trillion in funding includes $6 billion towards a civil nuclear credit program that provides financial support to reactors that are at risk of closing. And the package doubles down with $2.5 billion towards advanced reactor demonstrations with the goal of deployment before this decade is out. In an era of continued polarization, that level of bipartisan support for nuclear, it's remarkable, and it's only growing stronger. Thanks to decades of innovation, the advanced nuclear reactors that will soon be operational will look very different from the options just a few years ago. New nuclear reactors will come in all sizes, makes, and models. They'll have the flexibility to modify output and the versatility to pair up perfectly with variable sources like wind and solar. Advanced reactors open new possibilities for service really at any scale. So they offer entire states and major cities a way to transition away from fossil, but they also offer new solutions to isolated and more remote areas like Alaska or Puerto Rico that currently rely on more outdated carbon emitting sources and where large traditional reactors, quite frankly, don't make sense. We're seeing unprecedented demand for these scalable, smaller modular reactors, and we look forward to several of them coming online before 2030. Across the private sector, there are over 60 new nuclear technologies actively in development, many of which are moving toward demonstrations. Companies like NuScale, GE Hitachi, and Holtec are building on current light water reactor experience. Now, these designs can be less expensive to build than their predecessors. And then there's companies like X-Energy, Kairos Power, and Terrestrial Energy, and they're developing their own reactors, and they're opening the door for utilities to make zero carbon, pollution-free nuclear a part of their energy mix anywhere. Momentum is really picking up internationally as well. As Fatih Birol, the executive director of the International Energy Agency, put it at last year's UN conference on climate change, countries have reappreciated the value of nuclear power. At that same conference, NuScale announced an agreement with Nuclear Electrica, that's a Romanian nuclear energy producer, to clear the way for the deployment of Europe's first small modular reactor. And in Poland, several companies announced plans to replace retiring coal plants by building 4 to 6 small modular reactors, which can produce up to 300 megawatts electric each. And in Ukraine, Westinghouse Electric Company and Energoatom signed a contract to develop the country's first AP1000. These leaders are working across borders to create the clean energy future that we desperately need. And the financial community is also taking notice of the opportunity that nuclear presents. As we move towards a carbon-free energy system and advanced reactors move closer to build, sustainable nuclear energy becomes a better and better investment. According to a recent study, nuclear market revenues for US companies alone could be worth up to $1.9 trillion over the next 30 years. And at a community level, nuclear energy offers a just economic transition away from fossil fuels. Nuclear technology is American technology, and it creates good paying jobs, the kinds of jobs that can anchor a community. Today, the US nuclear energy sector directly employs nearly 100,000 people. The supply chain, which includes fuel, manufacturing, and maintenance, supports 4 times that many jobs. With greater investment in the next generation of nuclear energy, those figures could grow dramatically. Today's energy workers, including from legacy sources, can help build advanced reactors. Some skill requirements, like operating a steam turbine, they're highly transferable. And in some cases, next generation nuclear reactors can literally be built on fossil fuel sites. Much of the infrastructure at coal plants can be used for nuclear plants, which avoids the need for new transmission to connect these plants to the grid. A recent report from Scott Madden, an energy consulting firm, looked specifically at communities in the United States that were transitioning from coal to nuclear. And it estimated that each small modular reactor could provide hundreds of on-site jobs, more even than at similarly sized coal plants. These jobs would exist throughout the 60-plus year life of the plant and pay substantially higher wages. Hundreds of coal plants are scheduled to close in the next several years. Investment in nuclear energy can create high-paying jobs in places that badly need them while accelerating our journey to net zero. And that's why financial institutions need to update their ESG screens to include nuclear energy, because by doing so, they'll recognize the carbon-free electricity that it produces, the good-paying jobs it creates, and the crucial role it will play in addressing the climate crisis. Make no mistake, faced with an existential threat in climate change, the world is racing to net zero, and it's a race against the clock, and one we simply can't win without nuclear energy. But if we invest in nuclear energy, and if we make the right decisions today, achieving net zero doesn't need to be a zero-sum game. We have the technology, it's reliable, it's versatile, and it's never been more needed. Thank you, Sheila, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Maria. Maria, one of the continuing sagas that we are dealing with is what to do with nuclear waste, the waste from the existing facilities that are either shut down or are being shut down, and where to put it, how to store it, and transport it, and the whole package of issues that come with that. do you feel like there's progress being made on how to address the plants which have been retired, and our vision, your very beautifully stated vision as to why going forward nuclear would make sense without incorporating this storage of the, when the party's over, where to put the waste and what to do with it?
Great. Well, thanks for the question, Sheila. First, I'll start by saying all of the waste that we have from commercial nuclear power is very safely stored where it is. Maybe not as efficiently stored as it should be. As you mentioned, it's currently stationed at the sites that operated, that created this used fuel. But I'd reflect on a few things. We call it nuclear waste. I would tell you it's really transformed. There's a lot of good energy in that nuclear waste, and in the future, opportunities to reuse that. So I think we need to be a little bit thoughtful about the fact that we don't recycle today, but there are potential opportunities in our future, and we should leave this as a potential option for ourselves. So obviously it needs to be stored, and it could be stored more efficiently than it is today by sort of grouping it together. But let's just step back for a minute and talk about the volume of the waste, because I look at the nuclear industry actually being very proud that we are very thoughtful about the waste. And there are many other sources where that waste is not as thoughtfully cared for or maintained. And so I think the fact that we have it identified, that it's safely stored, that it's actually an option for some future energy production, at the end of the day, it's the federal government that needs to act to identify this long-term waste repository. And just recently, the DOE came out with a request for information on looking at interim storage. So I think that shows that this administration is very interested in sort of beginning and furthering the conversation on more efficient waste storage.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Obviously, it's going to be a challenge as issues that are worth taking on always are incredibly challenging, and will require the best and the brightest to come up with a scenario that will be acceptable regulatorily speaking, safety speaking, and also public perception as well. And I know that's something you're working extremely hard on with the companies who are members and well beyond with the U.S. government and the states as well. Maria, what about affordability? Can we really, as we go forward, some of the issues that have arisen with respect to even beautifully envisioned facilities is simple affordability, and how to deal with this affordability issue, and you're 1/4 of the way through, and suddenly what looked like it could be done for, say, $3 billion ends up with a price tag that looks more and more like $6 billion. And how do you contend, and what are the major issues that drive that stunning acceleration of cost that can happen?
Yeah, thanks. Again, as I talked in my prepared remarks, I would just say study after study has confirmed nuclear's potential to really lower system cost, and it's because it brings that sort of round-the-clock, highly reliable power that sort of helps, pair, if you will, with some of those intermittent sources overall. So I think that's one element that we have to really be thoughtful of as we sort of add nuclear into the overall mix. But let's talk a little bit about the concerns that you raised in terms of affordability and sort of construction concerns. And I'll reflect on that in a couple of ways. First, I would say, the industry needs to demonstrate and needs to show when we're saying, oh, these things can be built, more affordably, and they can be built on time and on schedule. Well, let's show that. And over the next 5 to 7 years, as we talk about these pilot plants coming online, that's an opportunity. I'd say we're all sort of in the catbird seat right now. Let's look, let's see. Obviously, the first one that's built, we would expect to be a little bit, higher because you're learning, you're doing things for the first time. But as we build more, we would only expect those to improve. So I would say right now we have a wonderful window of opportunity to check and see and watch as these things get built. Canada's also announced an SMR that they plan to have operational by 2028. You heard me mention in several other countries, and they all have this, sort of interest to sort of build sooner rather than later. So we're going to be able to get to nth of a kind, not just by a US build, but we can get to nth of a kind very quickly because you're going to build the same kind of thing in several different countries. And so I think that experience can sort of quickly be taken on. But the idea of a small modular reactor isn't just that it's small, because small, if it's $ per megawatt hour, you also have smaller megawatts, right? But it's simpler. In fact, what might even be better if we call an SMR a simple modular reactor instead of small, because you're not necessarily getting your cost improvement by just being small, but by being more simple. And so some of the systems and the safety systems that are involved in these designs are just much easier, passive. And as a result of that, there are just less components that are needed for these. And so when you think about why should this happen, they're smaller, so you can build them in a factory. The fact that they're simpler, there's sort of just less components. There's a lot of reasons why these newer designs have a reason to be more affordable and be able to meet the schedules and the costs. But at the same token, I would say, sort of don't just take it from me. We all have an opportunity to watch this play out, and I would encourage all of us to do that.
Thank you so much, Maria, for that very in-depth and brilliant presentation, really being a straightforward layout of the pros, cons, and the road ahead. So with that, thank you, Maria, and good luck, and have a great rest of the week.
Great. Thank you, Sheila.